Recent years have seen extreme weather conditions intensifying the drought, fires, floods, and cyclones that devastate communities across Queensland. Disaster recovery workers provide immediate and long-term support to those on their worst days, when they've lost their homes, their livelihood, or their loved ones. As disasters become more prevalent, their work is needed more than ever.
We began our project with an understanding from the literature that those who interact with trauma victims have a strong likelihood of developing stress or trauma symptoms themselves. Extended deployment times can increase an individual's risk of burnout and post-traumatic stress disorder. And appropriate pre-deployment mental health training and resources can decrease an individual's risk of developing stress or trauma disorders. What the literature didn't provide was a depth of understanding around how disaster recovery workers are affected by cumulative stress and vicarious trauma, and how they work through and become resilient to ongoing stressful and traumatic experiences.
This research aims to offer a window into the lived collective experience of disaster recovery workers through the stories of the Lifeline community recovery team. Ultimately, it is hoped that this research will provide Lifeline, Uniting Care, and other emergency relief organizations with a better understanding of how to address the well-being needs of their workers. The research questions leading this project are: how do disaster recovery workers experience cumulative stress and vicarious trauma following ongoing development in disaster recovery scenario? And the second one is: what affects disaster recovery workers' ability to cope with cumulative stress and vicarious trauma?
We have worked alongside 7 Lifeline community recovery workers and used semi-structured interviews to hear the stories around their deployments and everyday lives. We de-identified and transcribed their interviews and offered participants the opportunity to review their transcript. Our research findings were collated into a collective narrative using narrative analysis.
While we expected stories of extreme stress and trauma, instead we heard stories of resilience, camaraderie, and an infectious sense of love for the job. Through these stories, we identified several processes and techniques that led disaster recovery workers to stand resilient through the stress and trauma that comes with field work. These include: disaster recovery work is unpredictable and difficult to prepare for. Although this can be mentally and emotionally exhausting, resilience is built through the rewarding nature of the work in helping people. Rather than coming as already resilient to this type of work, workers develop resilience through the work itself. There are tensions between programmatic work and non-programmatic work. When non-programmatic work processes are unclear and unstructured, workers experience unnecessary stress as they spend more time and energy figuring out these tasks. This ultimately takes away from the emotional and mental energy required during community outreach. And lastly, recovery workers create boundaries in their work and day-to-day lives in order to deal with the stress and trauma more easily. Creating boundaries around work and normal life gives workers the space to deal with the issues before it dominates their lives.
We are 7 members of Lifeline's community recovery team, and this is our story. We all come from different walks of life, but we are all drawn to work that helps people. Our first experience with Lifeline was working on the phones on a volunteer basis. Through this phone work, we learned how to utilize unconditional positive regard, to see without seeing, and to hear through the silence. There isn't much you can do to prepare yourself, mentally and emotionally, for any particular deployment. The reality of this human work is that
I often just use my gut and go with the flow. There's only so much training that can prepare you for working in the field.
despite this uncertainty, our strong desire to help people and give back to the community gave us this resilience we needed to keep going. In outreach, we meet people on their worst day, people who have lost their houses, their entire herd of cattle hanging from trees and caught in barbed wire. Sometimes all we can do for these people is sit down and listen through the silence.
Lifeline are incredibly supportive. We feel safe, we feel heard. We're able to work well and keep working because of that.
Those of us who are team leaders ensure that we are always available to support our fellow team members.
That's something that we always do. We debrief with our team at the end of the day, but we always make ourselves available for anyone after that. If you want to chat, we're always here. We don't want to leave it until the next day.
To work in this field, it is essential for our well-being to understand the importance of boundaries and self-care. We need to balance our life and work.
I have a rule where we don't get out of the car until we finish talking about the issues that need to be talked about. We will stay in the car until that's done, so we don't bring it into the house.
When we get home, some of us feel like connecting back to the ordinary. We may go for a walk on the beach or drink a glass of red wine.
I need to do all of my housework and all my yard work and everything else to look after myself and my home and my dog.
Having this space to unwind and connect back to normality gives us the time to recharge and go back to doing what we love.